I'm going to be giving you a lot of information, so I hope that you find it helpful in preparing for this Florida Disaster Fund grant. As a quick note, Peyton's probably already told you guys this, but this presentation will be available to you. Also, the last slide will include Volunteer Florida's finance contact information. So I want you to know that we're always here to help you. If you ever have any questions or need assistance from us, just please do not hesitate to contact us. We're always happy to assist you, and we're always available to help you navigate through this process. So welcome, and let's go ahead and get started. So today's objectives will include understanding the grant and contract requirements, understanding what is allowable and unallowable under this grant. We will also talk about the match requirement and what it means. I will also go over supporting documentation requirements and help you understand the budget preparation requirements. The biggest thing I want you to remember is that when building your budget, it becomes the foundation for your project and it becomes part of your contractual obligation. Only costs that are in your approved budget will be accepted, so be sure that you're including as much as possible. Something to note is that we know needs may change throughout the grant year, so don't worry. If you're struggling with putting everything in there at this point, we will allow you to complete budget revisions if you are awarded a grant in the future. So this will help you, move around things and better serve that program as you move into that contracting period. The grant overview. The Florida Disaster Fund grants are overseen by the Volunteer Florida Foundation. Funding is provided by private donations that are made and designated directly to the Florida Disaster Fund. The funding purpose is to make financial resources available to help support recovery in the communities that were impacted by Hurricane Helene and or Hurricane Milton, and those counties who received a federal declaration for individual assistance. The purpose of funding is not administrative based, but rather project based to address unmet disaster recovery needs, again, for Hurricane Helene and or Hurricane Milton only. Also, preference is given to projects supporting recovery efforts from Hurricane Helene. The total funding that is available for this is $4.4 million, and your grant applications can range anywhere between $100,000 and $500,000. There is a 50% match required on this grant. This means that the organization will have to provide their own funding to cover another 50% of the total grant funds awarded. More on this to follow later in the presentation. These grants will be what we call cost reimbursement grants. So cost reimbursement grants only allow for the reimbursement of expenditures after expenses have been paid for. Even though you may operate under an accrual-based accounting system, cost reimbursement grants are submitted using your cash basis. Again, we're going to talk more about that and the documentation requirements later in the presentation. All electronic applications must be completed and include all your required documents as noted in the NOFO in Blackbaud no later than 5 p.m. on Tuesday, October the 28th. And right now the proposed contract period for these grants are December 1, 2025 to November 30th, 2026. All right, so grant and contract requirements. We must follow all applicable federal or state administrative and audit requirements. You must follow all specific terms and conditions stated in the award notification letter and contracts. You must follow the applicable Florida statutes and current policies of the state of Florida. Must also maintain all grant project records for at least 5 years after the end of the fiscal year in which the grant agreement is finalized or after your audit has been finalized, and must pay attention to all due dates and required reporting and adhere to them.
Yeah, I did get some notifications.
Sorry about that. All right, so again, all grantees must pay attention to due dates and reporting requirements, must submit them in a timely manner, and make sure you're adhering to those requirements. All right, we're going to move on to allowable costs. What is allowable under the grant? So for a cost to be allowable, you're going to hear us say this a lot in all of our trainings and all the time, is that it must be in your approved budget. They must be reasonable and necessary to carry out your specific project, and it must be consistent with your organization's policies and procedures. This means that if you're going to include, for example, something like mileage reimbursement for, say, travel to a project site, but your company doesn't usually reimburse for mileage, then you would not be able to use this grant to pay for the mileage. The other requirement is that costs must not be included as a cost or be used to meet cost sharing or matching requirements of any other program. And yes, I know that you've probably heard the saying, if it is not documented, it didn't happen. So you'll hear me represent or talk about that several times, supporting documents, documentation. So just remember that if it was not documented, it didn't happen. All right, for costs to be eligible under this grant, again, they must be related to your long-term recovery activities and must support the approved project or projects in your application. And again, be in your approved budget. Be sure you're including all expenditures in your budget that you will need to complete your projects. All right, this slide talks about what is allowable under the grant. So you see there's section A, B, C, and D. So section A are general administrative and operating costs. This can include salaries, benefits, travel, rent, anything that benefits the approved project and purpose. One thing to note that in section A, administrative costs cannot exceed 10% of your budget. One thing to also note that is if you have an indirect cost rate or a federally approved indirect cost rate, and if that rate is higher than 10%, that we will still only allow a maximum of 10%. And if you do have one of those rates and it is lower than that, then you must use it. All right, contractual costs under section B. This would be for things of like hiring contractors to complete your tasks and projects. So say like you want to install roofs, you may want to decide to contract with a roofer. This would be an example of that cost. Section C is materials and products. Again, this would be purchasing direct supplies or materials to help you complete the task or project. Again, with a roofing example, those supplies, you would include supplies that you need to install roofs. And then section D, equipment, furniture, and fixtures. This would be purchasing equipment, furniture, fixtures to complete your task and project. All right, things that are not allowable. Unallowable costs we'll be looking for are those that are not associated with your approved project. Requesting reimbursement for things over the state of Florida limits and taxes. All organizations are required to be tax exempt and therefore should not be paying taxes. We will not reimburse for any taxes, so please be sure that you're not including taxes in your budgeted costs. Other costs that are unallowable include things like refreshments, food, beverages, entertainment, staff retreats, trainings, or other expenditures that do not directly relate to the scope of your project or benefit long-term recovery, and again, that are not in your approved budget. When you're building your budget, please keep these requirements in mind to ensure you'll be able to comply with all invoicing and requirements. Also, supporting documentation will be required for all expenditures, both reimbursable and match. And again, we will talk more about that here shortly. All right, supporting documentation. The reason I'd like to go over supporting documentation is to give you an idea of what is going to be required. So when you're building these budgets, you have that in mind. So if you know, so for instance, personnel expenses, one of the top supporting documentation will be required is timesheets. If you know that you do not have a timesheet system or do not want to adopt a timesheet system, you're not going to want to include personnel expenses in your budget because you're not going to be able to properly document them and get reimbursement for them. So I want to go through the different types of supporting documentation so you know and you're aware of it. Again, personnel expenses will be timesheets. Those timesheets would have to be signed and dated by an employee or supervisor, have certification statements, and note the hours that are being worked towards your project. And then documentation of proof of payment, which would be pay stubs, payroll journals, and proof that it cleared the bank. Same thing with fringe benefits. We're going to need registers and journals. We're going to need invoices from any of those that you may include. If it's healthcare, it would be an invoice from the healthcare company noting the employees and the amounts paid. And then, of course, again, proof of payment. You're going to hear me talk about supporting documentation and proof of payment. When I say that, we're going to want copies of cleared checks, bank statements, online confirmations of payment. These must all have payment dates, the amount paid, and they must show that they've cleared the bank. So you'll see a common theme in most of this documentation. Here's travel. If you decide to put travel, again, there'll be a need for travel reimbursement forms. Something that is, produced within the organization, signed by the employee and supervisor, and include all the travel related expenses you're being requesting reimbursement for. And again, proof of payment. Contractual costs, you're going to want we're going to need a copy of your contract, the invoice from the contract that's identifying all costs. And again, proof of payments. This slide talks about copies of clear checks. If it's paid by credit card, you're going to ask that also provide their credit card statement and prove you paid the credit card statement before those expenses can be reimbursed. So just wanting you to keep this in mind when building your budget. Same thing again for materials and products and the equipment, furniture, and fixtures. Detailed receipts, detailed invoices, and proof of payments. And then general administrative and operating costs, things, if you're including things like rent. Again, we'd want a copy of the lease agreement. There's very specific things in that agreement that's listed here that we'll want to see. And then again, proof of payments, and the copy in form of copies, cleared checks, proof of your bank statement showing that the check's cleared. So again, documentation is required for all expenditures. It's going to be required for your FDF expenditures, which are those that you'll be reimbursed for, and your match expenditures, which are those that your organization will provide. So the same documentation that we're requesting will be required for both of those types of expenditures. All right, just to kind of go over the state of Florida in case you're not familiar with, Volunteer Florida is under the state of Florida, so we follow the state of Florida rules, policies, procedures, regulations. So if you happen to put travel, the state of Florida maximum mileage reimbursement rate is 0.445 cents per mile. You cannot be reimbursed for mileage and gas, and lodging cannot exceed $225 per night. This slide also goes into what meals or per diem rates are. The total per day is $36, and this gives you a breakout of $6 for breakfast, $11 for lunch, and $19 for dinner, and then shows you the time breakdowns for those. All right. So let's talk about match. We've had a lot of questions so far regarding match. So you heard me mention earlier that there's a 50% match requirement with these grants. So what that means is if you request a if you request a $50,000 grant, you will be required to match those funds by 25%, therefore making a total grant of $75,000. So you're going to receive $50,000 in FDF funds. Your organization is going to provide 50% of that at $25,000 match for a total grant of $75,000. Match can be cash or in kind, and we will allow the use of state or federal funds to meet match as long as your funders are aware and they have approved you to do so. If that is the case, we will request the approval documentation if you decide to use any state or federal funds to match the grant. You cannot use match that has already been used to match other funding sources. We call that double dipping, and that would be unallowable. And also, again, match must be documented. So again, the same documentation that I was describing about your request for reimbursement of expenditures will also be required for match expenditures. One thing that is unique about this grant is that it also allows you to use volunteer hours for match. So those volunteer hours must be within the actual contract period. The hours must be documented and then provided with your monthly invoices. So documentation for volunteer hours will include something that states the volunteer's name, dates and time that the hours were served, and would also need to be certified and signed. Hours can be valued right now at $33 per hour, which is what the Florida Independent Sector rate is for the value of volunteer hours. Every April, this rate does change. It could increase or decrease. If it does change in April, we will notify you and you will be able to use the new rate moving forward during the grant year. All right, and just one more thing about match. You will see it on the budget template. The section at the bottom says source of funds. The source of funds section is where you will complete the information on your funding. So there you will list your source of funds for the match portion of your grant. And then you will note the dollar amount that it's being used to cover within your grant and whether it is cash or in kind. And I'll show you an example a few slides ahead of now. We'll have an example to show you that. All right, we're moving right along. So let's talk about budget preparation. As you're preparing this budget, keep in mind that all costs included in the budget should be written out in an equation format. So a calculation should be provided for each cost for both your reimbursable and match expenditures. You may also include a quote for the dollar amount provided. Any documentation you give us ahead of time will aid us in making that review and determination of whether the expenses are allowable. All costs should be rounded to the nearest dollar. So we like to make every effort that we can, round up or round down. So if you're at 49 cents or lower, you're going to round down to the nearest dollar. If you are up 50 cents or higher, you'll round up to the nearest dollar. Again, all costs should be itemized and be listed separately. There should also be no miscellaneous costs or fillers. And we must not have anything that is generic like office supplies or roofing supplies. If you are going to purchase roofing supplies, you must list each supply separately and the cost for each of those items. Again, all costs must be incurred within the contract date. So for example, this contract starts December 1st. An expenditure that you incur in the month of November would not meet this requirement and would not be a reimbursable expense and would not be able to be used as match. Again, here's that second or third or fourth or fifth reminder. Supporting documentation will be required for both your reimbursable and match expenditures. So please keep this in mind when building your budget and including costs. All right, so these next few slides, I put in a sample of what I talk about when I say the cost should be included in equation format, include a calculation, and be itemized. So these next few slides are going to show you all of that. And then the slide after that is going to show you a completed budget template with all of these in there. But just kind of to go over, starting with section A, again, remember section A, administrative costs and cannot exceed 10% of your maximum total budget. So in your sample, you'll see in a moment, we have a total budget amount of $749,282. So this means that your 10% admin costs may not exceed $74,928. All right, and so I go into the calculations. Here we're going to do a program manager, their salary with their time spent on the grant, their FICA, their health insurance, and their travel. And note how each one is put into a calculation. Section B, this is your contracting section. So notice we put that there's going to be a roofing contractor. We're going to hire them, how much per hour, how many hours, and how long. Permits and fees, volunteer hours. We're going to use some volunteers to help in the contracting section, in the roofing section. So we've valued them at the $33 per hour, how many hours each of those volunteers will do each month, and the number of volunteers. And then we valued those volunteer hours as match. Right, the next slide does the same thing. Section C talks about supplies, metal roofing supplies. 75 per site, 10 per site, 45 each. So we're talking about the metal roofing. We're talking about metal, the actual metal roofing. I don't know what you call them, slides or whatever. So Painting supplies, we got a written quote, so we put in parentheses that there's a quote. On that quote, it's gonna list out the exact supplies and where they came up with that total $56,000. Again, insulation, we included. So as you see, each thing is itemized, each thing is listed separately, provides a dollar amount for each and how many of each you're buying. Again, section D, same thing. Equipment, furniture, fixtures. We've done air conditioned units, we've done stoves, we've done hot water heaters. All right, and this is a slide that brings all of that together into one. You'll see, so we'll start with section A. You see the section A total is that 72,292. If you look down at your total budget amount, it's 749,282. So that is less than 10% of the grant. So you're within that guideline. You see that, say for instance, program manager salary, 70,000 times 80% of their time is $56,000. So you'll see in the total column, it's $56,000. That's the total amount. And then it is split. So we're saying the Florida Disaster Fund funds are going to reimburse $28,000 of that total salary. And under the match portion, your organization is going to get other funding to pay for and match the remaining portion of that salary. So you can see that in all the different lines where we have either split it to where the organization's going to provide a certain amount, or whether it's all going to be provided by FDF funds. When you get down to the bottom, you will see that the 276,390 is just right at 50.1%. So these amounts on here are less. So the way you figure out your 50% is by taking your total grant of 472,892, divide that by 2, and that's what you have to provide and match. So in this instance, 276,390 takes you just above that required 50%. At the bottom, you notice the match where I talked about provide your name of your funding sources. So right here, we're saying that we're going to use the state of Florida DOE funding, and it's going to cover that section A, everything in section A for that $42,150, and that's going to be cash. Okay, and then our second line, we're going to get a Home Depot grant, and it's going to provide us the $60,000 to do the painting supplies, the insulation, the stoves, and the hot water heaters. And that's going to be both cash and in kind, because in the example I provide, Home Depot's going to throw in the hot water heaters for us for basically for free. So no cash is going to extend hands, but we're going to be able to value it and use it as an in kind. And then it lists out the volunteer hours. Notice up in section B, we talked about contracts, contractual costs, and we put volunteer hours there. You see that volunteer hours is $174,240. And again, that is in kind. So this is what we want to see in your budget. I want to see the equations, the calculations. You want to see your splits between your FDF funds and your match, depending on what portion your organization is going to provide of what expenditures. You want to see that it's got a 50% match, and that section A does not exceed that allowable 10%. All right. We are almost there. I'm going to go ahead right now and just slip over real quick to advance requests. So in the NOFO, I know most of you have seen that a request for advance payment form is in the package for you if you feel like this would be something you would like to do. You'll be required to provide an advance payment form with the application package. And again, that is on attachment B. The advance request must not exceed 20% of your FDF award. Monthly invoices will be submitted and used to account for or offset the advance funds. Once your advance funds have been accounted for, then reimbursements will continue on a cost reimbursement basis as normal. No other payments will be made until all of the advance funds have been accounted for. So if you do receive an advance, we will take those monthly invoices you submit, we will offset that advance, and then once that advance has been spent, then we will start issuing you more funding for what you've invoiced for. Advances, again, will be issued once all startup documents have been received, the contracts have been signed, and that the budget has been verified and approved. So they will not take place until after all of those have been met. And then the next two slides just kind of give you an idea of what that attachment B looks like. Again, here, if you're requesting in advance, you're going to check the box, you're going to put the amount, you're going to make sure that that is less than 20% of the total award. You're going to sign and date this. And then page 2, you're going to provide a detailed justification for each of these items and where you want to request advance funds. You're going to provide an explanation as to why you need them and what you need them for. And then again, you'll submit that. It'll be reviewed in-house. And then once it's signed off on, then we will run through. We'll check for supporting documentation. We'll check for the contract and make sure the budget is approved. And then those funds will be issued. All right, and just real quick, this is attachment E. It's the last attachment in the NOFO. All of these are pretty much all of the finance documentation that's going to be required to be submitted with your applications. Make sure that you are using this as a checklist so that when you submit your application, all of this is included. You're going to need the budget on the Volunteer Florida Foundation template. There's an agreement and a certification form and a copy of your board of directors list requirement. You'll need to provide us your IRS determination letter to verify your 501c3 status, a copy of your organization's annual budget, your most recent W-9 using the 2024 template, Volunteer Florida Foundation's vendor EFT authorization form, and your most recent financial statements and audit. So if your organization does have audits, then we are going to require copies of your last 2 years of audits with the management letter and or reports on internal controls. If your organization does not have an audit or typically does not do audits, then what we will require is 2 years worth of balance sheets, statement of financial positions, and the statement of cash flows. So just make sure you're using that checklist, making sure you're including all of that when you submit your application. All right, so you've made it. That is it. I know that was a lot of information in a small time. I want to thank you for joining me today, and I hope you really found this information helpful and have a better understanding of FDF grants and the requirements and the budget prep. Again, the finance team's contact information is included on the last slide. So again, if you have any questions or need assistance, please do not hesitate to contact us. We're always here to help you and assist you with your needs and are available to help you navigate the process.
And we do have some questions in the chat. Amy,
Yes.
yes, this presentation will be made available on the website as well. But we do have some finance related questions. We can go through those and then we can go through hands. Dan asked if, he said, I understand personnel expenses can be up to 10% of the total project cost. Your example showed that 10% being split into FDF and match columns. Can we place the entire 10% under the FDF column?
Yes, you can. So my example just kind of showed both. And just didn't want to, the idea is that you're not exceeding that 10%. So yes, if you put it all in FDF, then that is fine. It just cannot exceed 10%.
Great. Luke had a couple questions. He asked, can the organization leverage an existing grant that covers a portion of staff salary, for example, 75%, and get matched the remaining 25% from Volunteer Florida?
So if I think you're saying this correctly, or I'm saying this correctly, you're saying that you have an existing grant that is currently covering 75% of a salary and you want to use that as match? Or you want to get match, it's saying, and get match from Volunteer Florida. So you're not going to get match from Volunteer Florida. What you'll get from Volunteer Florida are the actual FDF funds. So you could use those to pay 25% as long as that staff member is spending 25% of their time on the grant. Not sure if that answered your question or not.
That does. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
He also asked for matching grants outside of VF. Do those funds need to be secured at time of application, or can they be submitted and waiting with the prospective funder?
Yeah, An application, yes, they can be secured or proposed. We would appreciate if you would put that in your budget for us. So when you're listing out that funder, you would put the Bank of America Foundation, put in parentheses, proposed, so that we're aware of that.
Lauren
Thank you so
asks,
much.
You're welcome.
Lauren asks for budget. We want to have all 90% of the grants funds plus matches go towards construction and contractors. We do not at this stage know what each homeowner will need in regard to repairs, as each home will have sustained different amounts of damage. Are we able to give more of a general budget based on our experience from a similar program that we currently manage?
Absolutely. I would encourage you to do that.
Cher said, we are a current grantee with Volunteer Florida. We anticipate using our $125,000 grant by December 31st. We've already committed approximately 75% of those funds through payroll, contracts, and building supplies. Would we meet the 75% expended requirement for applying by the October 28th deadline? Yes, we did previously explain that it cannot be just allocated. It does have to be fully expensed. So as long as it is expensed by the October 28th deadline, then yes. If they are not fully expensed and they are only allocated, you would not qualify. And then Cher also said, we've been in continuous operation for over 2 years with financial records from our founding through today. The IRS status began on January of 2024. One completed fiscal year and full records for the current year. Does that meet the financial statement requirement?
So the requirement is that you provide 2 years of that. I would say please reach out to us after this and we can talk with our CFO on that.
Awesome. So that is all of them in the chat. Alexis, what was your question?
Hi, I just had a question on the 10% administrative overhead. Do you need backup receipts for that overhead, such as rent, phone bill, etc., or is 10% for various overhead gonna cut it?
Nope, it is very specific, itemized, and documentation is required for everything.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
All right, we have a question.
Yeah, that's just an example. So yes, the maxes for these grants are 100,000 to 500,000. So that is the FDF request.
Awesome. Do we have any additional questions? You can either put them into the chat, or if you can raise your hand, we can call on you. If we ask for $100,000, how much is our match and how much is the total to spend?
Okay, so if you're asking for $100,000, 50% of that is 50,000. So you'll receive 100,000 in FDF funds. Your organization will provide 50,000 in funding for a total spend of $150,000. You're welcome.
Do we have any additional questions?
All right, we'll keep them coming. Again, our contact information is on this last slide. You will get these sent to you, so you'll have that information. So if more questions come up, you're unsure, please reach out to us so we can assist you.
Yeah, and the PowerPoint side and a recording of this presentation today will be made available on the Volunteer Florida website, probably in the next couple days. Awesome. If we do not have any other questions, I do adjourn. Thank you all for participating, and I hope you have a great rest of your evening.